Dear Governor, dear organizers of this event, dear guests and dear participants in this panel, let me welcome you to the first panel of this extremely interesting and timely conference. My name is Gerald Knaus. I'm chairman of a think tank based in Berlin and Istanbul. I've spent the last 20 years living in many of the countries that we are going to discuss here, in Ukraine, in Bulgaria, 8 years in Istanbul, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the late 90s. And I've been asked by the organizers to not only introduce this excellent panel and set this conference off to a good start, but perhaps to also throw out a few initial thoughts on the issue of the conference. And let me start out with 4 observations about enlargement and what we've learned and where we stand. The first one on uncertainty. It is today unthinkable that the enlargement and the consequences that Governor Novotny described might not have happened. But it was possible that it would not have happened as late as the 1990s, 1996. When Czech President Václav Havel went to Aachen and gave a speech and said and pleaded with the Germans not to waste an opportunity that was unprecedented, as he put it, in European history. The failure to grasp this chance, Václav Havel said in 1996, would open the door to those who prefer violence. As late as 1995, Timothy Garton-Ash in Oxford wrote an essay saying Europe was catching the wrong bus. Europe was not focused on enlargement. And if today we take for granted that these maps in our heads of a larger European Union, imagine for a moment what the situation would be today without Poland in the EU, without the Baltics in the EU, without Romania and Bulgaria in the EU. The second observation is that this happened not, as some in Moscow think today, because after the end of the Cold War, there was a push by the winners in the Cold War to expand their sphere of influence. In fact, those winners had to be dragged kicking and screaming to accept new members to their clubs. In 1995, Václav Havel describes in his book on his time as a politician a very interesting conversation with Richard Holbrooke, where Richard Holbrooke was saying, look, the Germans don't want to let you into NATO. This was 1995. And the EU is a very long-distance goal. Let's focus on trying to get you into NATO. Václav Havel is the best example. He became president in 1989. He was president for 13 years. When the Czech Republic joined the EU, he was no longer president. This was not a quick process. And it happened because leaders pushed against the skeptics in EU capitals and against the skeptics on NATO in the US. Third observation. They did so because they had expectations. Enlargement was supposed to bring stability, prosperity, and consolidate democracies. And as we've just seen, some of these expectations were met beyond what could have been hoped for. And yet, it was these expectations that also led to their neighbors, and this is my fourth observation, in the European East, to see what had happened and want to join as well. So after 2000, we had the Western Balkans, we had Turkey, we had recently Moldova, and we now spectacularly have Ukraine, trying to get some of that stability, prosperity, and consolidation. While others in Moscow and elsewhere drew different conclusions. They saw this enlargement as a threat, as a geopolitical power grab. They wanted to stop it. And as Lilia Shevtsova will tell us about the Putin doctrine, they are determined to put their imprint on some of these countries. Which leaves us with 3 questions for our panel. If important EU leaders were skeptical in the 90s and are even more skeptical today, is the story of enlargement over? In 2014, is there still an ongoing story of enlargement? We've already seen Turks, Macedonians, and others turn away, revert in their standards, in their democratic reforms, no longer really believing it would happen. And second, at this moment, we clearly will have to discuss Ukraine. Is Ukraine part of the European enlargement story? What part of the story of Europe is Ukraine part of today? Because there was always a dark alternative, and we've seen it in the 90s in the former Yugoslavia. A story not of integration, but disintegration and war. And third, can those benefits that enlargement was supposed to bring and brought of prosperity, of strategic security, of democratic consolidation, can they be had outside of an enlargement context? And can they be reversed even where they have been achieved? Is the current situation a threat even to those democracies in the Baltics, in Poland, in the Balkans, that thought that by joining the European Union and NATO, these threats would be a thing of the past? To discuss these issues, we have a fantastic panel. We will start with Olga Bielkova, who's come to us from Kiev, an economist. She also studied at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she has a very good sense of timing because she joined the Ukrainian parliament in November 2012. So she clearly likes adventure. This must be one of the hardest jobs for a parliamentarian today in Europe. And we look forward to see what she has to tell us. She will do a presentation on Ukraine between competing forces today. Then we have Lilia Shevtsova. Now, she's written 15 books, and the titles of her books give you, well, it says on your website. I know some of them. I recommend them highly. Russia Lost in Transition, Lonely Power, Change or Decay. The titles give you the program. She's recently written on the Putin Doctrine. And one of the titles in that essay is How Does the West Read Putin? Which I suppose is why Wikipedia in English describes you as a Kremlinology expert. I didn't know they still existed. But she's definitely at Carnegie in Moscow since 1995, one of the leading experts on Russia. Finally, we have Ivan, the third speaker. Always challenging conventional wisdoms. We met first in '94 in Bulgaria when the conventional wisdom was Bulgaria is in limbo and has no chance of going anywhere. Ivan and his friends then challenged that successfully. But now, in the last few years, it's been challenging conventional wisdoms in the EU about corruption, about populism, about trust and transparency, about whether the EU could go the way the Habsburg Empire could go. Now, challenging conventional wisdoms by Bulgarian is interesting because Bulgarians, as you know, are the most pessimistic people in the world. The famous 2009 Gallup poll, where people were asked around the world what life will be like in 5 years' time, the Bulgarians were more pessimistic than Iraqis and Afghans. And only in Bulgaria will you have scientific articles on the pursuit of unhappiness, the puzzle of Bulgaria's pessimism. But only Ivan's Institute will write an essay on the optimistic theory about pessimism of transition in Bulgaria. So as an optimistic pessimist, we look forward to your intervention. And finally, we have Herbert Stepic. We've heard about EU enlargement, we've heard about NATO enlargement, then there is Stepic enlargement. The story of Raiffeisen and other banks in Austria that took the chance. I think you would then be a pessimistic optimist, as bankers have to be, expecting that things will pay off in the long term, but seeing the dangers in the short term. Recently, you gave an interview to Wirtschaftswoche about Ukraine, where you said there is no solution for Ukraine without Russia, but where you were cautiously optimistic about the new team in power in Kiev. It will be very interesting to see your perspective as a veteran of economic integration on what we discuss. So let's start with our friend from Kiev, the Member of Parliament, Olga Bielkova.